It was a glamorous night at La Belle Maison, the most expensive restaurant in the city, where every bottle of wine cost more than most people made in a month. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, reflecting off sequined gowns and polished shoes. Laughter echoed from every corner, though most of it sounded fake, the kind of laughter rich people used when they wanted to show off their teeth, not their hearts. Among the waiters, moving like shadows between the tables, stood Amelia Torres, a calm, graceful black woman with tired eyes, but an air of quiet dignity. She had worked there for almost 2 years, but tonight would change everything. At the center table sat Arthur Blake, a well-known millionaire with an ego larger than his fortune. Surrounded by foreign investors, he was laughing loudly, his voice carrying over the music. Then, suddenly, he snapped his fingers. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, swirling the champagne in his glass. "How much do you make here per month?" Amelia hesitated, but answered politely, "Enough to live, sir." Arthur smirked, turning to his guests. "Enough to live, she says. I bet she's never seen 100,000 in her life." With a cruel grin, he pulled out a wad of cash from his jacket pocket and tossed it onto her silver tray. 100,000. All yours. If you serve me in French, from start to finish. No mistakes. The room fell silent. The piano stopped mid-note. Every eye turned to her. "What's wrong?" Arthur mocked. "Cat got your tongue? Or do you admit you're only good for cleaning tables?" Amelia felt her cheeks burn. It wasn't about the money. It was about the humiliation. Those bills on her tray suddenly felt heavier than bricks. She looked around the room. Some people were laughing, others pretended not to see. But deep inside her, something fierce awoke. Arthur shook his head, smirking. "I thought you might have some brains, but I guess I was wrong." Then Amelia lifted her gaze, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I accept your challenge, Mr. Blake." The laughter stopped. Even Arthur's grin froze for a moment. The entire restaurant held its breath. From that instant on, what began as a cruel joke was about to turn into one of the greatest lessons Arthur Blake would ever learn in his life. The sound of Amelia's voice lingered in the air, soft but commanding. For a moment, even the clinking of glasses and forks froze. Arthur Blake leaned back in his chair, clearly amused. He loved a show, especially when he believed he'd already written the ending. "Good," he said smugly. "Then let's make it entertaining." Around the room, murmurs rippled like waves. Some whispered, "Is she serious?" Others chuckled, certain she'd humiliate herself in seconds. The waiters exchanged nervous glances. They all knew how things went when Arthur decided to play. He didn't just like control, he fed on it. Amelia, however, stood motionless. Inside, her thoughts were a storm, but outside, she was as steady as stone. She had faced worse than a spoiled man's arrogance. Her life had already stripped her of everything but grace. And that was something no one could take. As she gathered her breath, her eyes drifted over the pile of money still lying on her tray. 100,000. Enough to pay rent for a year. Enough to buy the medication her mother needed. Enough to fix everything that had broken. But no, this wasn't about money. This was about respect. "Do you really think she'll do it?" whispered one of the investors in a thick accent. Arthur chuckled, tapping his glass. "I've met enough of her kind to know they all talk big until it's time to deliver." Her kind. Those two words hit harder than the insult itself. She'd heard them all her life, from professors who doubted her, from interviewers who liked her energy but not her skin. and now from a man who saw her as a novelty in his show of wealth. Amelia's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Silence was her shield. She looked at Arthur and simply nodded once. That quiet gesture carried more strength than any insult she could have thrown back. Arthur didn't notice the subtle shift in the room, the way a few guests now looked at her differently, almost in admiration. He was too busy entertaining himself, too busy underestimating the very woman who would soon rewrite his evening and his reputation. "Fine," Arthur said, signaling to the maitre d'. "Bring her the menu. Let's see if she can handle a few fancy French words." As the waiter hurried away, Amelia took a slow breath. Beneath her calm exterior, her heart pounded. Memories flickered like film reels. Old long nights spent studying foreign phonetics. Old classrooms filled with students repeating French vowels after her voice. She had once been Dr. Amelia Torres, linguist, lecturer, researcher. But now, she was a waitress in a borrowed uniform, standing in front of a man who thought knowledge came with a price tag. And soon, he would learn.
Some lessons cost far more than money. As the maître d' disappeared into the kitchen, Amelia's reflection caught her eye in one of the mirrored columns. The uniform, the tray, the faint circles under her eyes, all of it felt like a disguise. It wasn't who she was, at least not who she used to be. 3 years earlier, her name had meant something. Dr. Amelia Torres, professor of linguistics at the University of Cambridge, a specialist in phonetics and cross-cultural communication, fluent in 7 languages. Her lectures were always packed. Her students adored her. She'd been invited to speak in Paris, Madrid and Seoul, teaching people how language could build bridges instead of barriers. But life, as she often said to her students, speaks its own language. And sometimes it doesn't ask if you're ready to translate it. It started with a phone call in the middle of a snowy London night. "Miss Torres," said a trembling voice, "your mother has collapsed, it's serious." Her mother, Lucia, her best friend, her anchor, had suffered a massive stroke. Within days, Amelia dropped everything. She flew back home, signed hospital papers, spent nights by the bed holding her mother's cold hands. At first, she believed things would get better, but recovery required expensive therapy, medication and a specialized nurse. Insurance didn't cover half of it. She sold her car, then her apartment, then her books. And when that wasn't enough, she resigned from her position to become her mother's full-time caregiver. Months turned into years. The money ran out. The university replaced her position. Colleagues stopped returning her calls. The world that had once praised her brilliance quietly erased her existence. One afternoon, with her mother asleep in a hospital room and rent overdue, Amelia saw a flyer. Staff needed, La Belle Maison restaurant, evening shifts. She took it without thinking twice. Pride didn't pay bills. And so, Dr. Amelia Torres became Mia, the quiet waitress. Now, standing under the golden lights of the restaurant, that memory burned in her chest. She had spent years letting people talk down to her, treating her like she was invisible. But tonight, something inside her refused to stay silent. Because this wasn't just another shift. This was the moment life handed her the microphone back, and she intended to speak, fluently. Arthur Blake loved attention the way others loved oxygen. He couldn't live without it. Every gesture he made was calculated, rehearsed, designed to make him the center of gravity wherever he stood. His fortune was built on power plays and public humiliations. To him, people were pieces on a board, and tonight, Amelia was just another pawn in his game. He leaned back in his velvet chair, swirling the wine in his glass as though he were holding the universe itself. "You see," he said to his guests, "life is simple. There are winners and there are servants. And sometimes," he added with a grin, "servants forget their place." One of the investors shifted uncomfortably. "Arthur," said Mr. Hahn, a quiet man in his 50s, "maybe this is not—" Arthur cut him off with a wave.
"Oh, come on, Han, don't ruin the fun. We're just teaching her a lesson. Besides, if she's so confident, let's see what she's got." He raised his voice so everyone in the restaurant could hear. "Attention, everyone. Tonight we're going to witness something educational." A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Amelia stood still, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Arthur motioned to the waiter who had just returned. "Bring her the French menu, the one we use for the Parisian investors. Let's see if our little waitress can handle sophistication." The waiter hesitated. "Sir, that menu contains over 40 dishes with complex culinary terms." "Perfect," Arthur interrupted, smirking. "Let's make it challenging." A hush fell over the tables as the menu was placed in Amelia's hands. The golden letters on the leather cover gleamed beneath the chandelier. For everyone else it was a joke, but for her it was something else. A door, a chance. Arthur grinned, tapping the table with his ring. "Here's the deal. You have 5 minutes to describe any 5 dishes in perfect French with proper pronunciation. If you succeed, you get the money. If you fail, you apologize here in front of everyone for wasting my time." Someone gasped. Another whispered, "That's cruel." Arthur's voice cut through the murmurs. "Cruel? No, it's justice. People should know their limits." Amelia looked at him, her eyes steady and calm. "And what about you, Mr. Blake? Do you know yours?" Arthur laughed loudly, tilting his head back. "Mine? Sweetheart, I make the limits." The arrogance in his tone was thick enough to choke the air. But what no one realized, not even Arthur, was that his words had just sealed his fate. Because the woman he was trying to break wasn't made of glass. She was made of steel.
Polished, quiet, and ready to strike. Arthur Blake wasn't satisfied with the gasps he'd already earned. He wanted shock. He wanted control. And most of all, he wanted the kind of laughter that echoed, the cruel kind that fed his ego. He stood up from his chair, his tailored suit glinting under the golden light. "Let's make it more interesting," he said, pacing slowly around the table. "If she fails, she'll get on her knees right here and apologize, not just to me, but to everyone in this room for pretending to be something she's not." A heavy silence dropped over the restaurant. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the pianist's hands hovered above the keys. "Arthur," one of the investors murmured, visibly uneasy. "This isn't right." Arthur turned to him, smiling, as though he hadn't just demanded someone's public humiliation. "Relax, my friend. It's just a game. Don't tell me you've gone soft." He turned back to Amelia. "Do we have a deal, sweetheart?" Amelia's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The room felt smaller, like the walls themselves were closing in. She could sense every eye on her, some filled with pity, others with curiosity. No one believed she could do it. But that didn't matter. She met Arthur's gaze without blinking. "If I fail, I'll apologize," she said, her tone calm, almost serene. "But if I succeed, you'll pay me right here, in front of everyone, every single note." Arthur blinked. For the first time, his grin faltered. He hadn't expected her to agree so easily. "You're really confident, aren't you?" "I just believe in fairness," she replied softly. The waiter brought the French menu and placed it carefully in her hands. Arthur crossed his arms, leaning back with a smirk. "Fine, you've got one chance. Don't embarrass yourself." As Amelia opened the menu, a hush swept across the room. Her fingers traced the delicate gold lettering: foie gras de canard, bouillabaisse provençale, coq au vin. Familiar words, words that had once filled her lectures. She took a deep breath. For a second, she was back in her university classroom in Paris, explaining pronunciation to her students, her mother smiling in the front row. Arthur snapped his fingers, breaking the moment. "Well, we're waiting." The investors shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the room was a living thing now, crawling over every surface. Amelia closed the menu gently and looked up. "Before we begin," she said, her voice firm but polite, "I'd like to know something. Will you judge my words yourself, Mr. Blake, or will you leave that to those who actually speak French?" The crowd reacted. A few gasps, a few suppressed laughs. Arthur's smirk twitched. "Don't get clever with me," he said sharply. "I understand enough." "Of course," Amelia said quietly. "That's what I was afraid of." Arthur slammed his hand on the table, rattling the glasses. "Enough talk! Show us what you've got!" And as Amelia took her first slow breath, lifting her chin, a strange calm settled over her. This wasn't fear anymore. It was purpose. Quiet, steady, and unstoppable. Tonight, the servant was about to teach the master a lesson he would never forget. Amelia stood there, still as a sculpture, her hand resting on the heavy French menu. The whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath. The clinking of glasses, the laughter, even the soft background music, everything faded into silence. All that remained was her steady heartbeat and Arthur Blake's smug grin. "Well," he sneered, leaning back in his chair, "we're all waiting, sweetheart." Amelia didn't answer. She simply opened the menu, flipped through a few pages, and then, as calm as a summer breeze, began to speak. Her voice came out soft but crystal clear, carrying the melody of a language few in the room could understand. "Bonsoir, messieurs et mesdames. Permettez-moi de vous présenter notre sélection spéciale de ce soir." Heads turned. Forks froze mid-air. Every syllable flowed from her lips with perfect pronunciation, elegant, fluent, effortless. The investors exchanged astonished looks. One of them whispered, That's perfect Parisian French." Arthur blinked, confused. "Wait, what did she just say?" he muttered, looking around for validation. The investor beside him leaned forward. She greeted everyone and introduced the evening's special menu, perfectly. The smirk slid off Arthur's face for the first time that night. But Amelia wasn't done. Her tone deepened, her confidence blossoming with every word. "Nous commencerons avec le foie gras de canard préparé selon la tradition de Strasbourg, accompagné d'une compote de figues et d'un pain brioché doré au beurre." The crowd listened in stunned silence. Her voice wasn't just fluent, it was graceful, poetic, alive. Then she translated, softly, as if teaching a class. "This is a duck foie gras prepared in the traditional Strasbourg style, served with fig compote and buttered brioche." Her English explanation rolled off her tongue like silk, each phrase polished, natural, precise. Arthur tried to laugh, but it came out awkward, almost forced. Okay, that's one dish. Don't get too excited." "Le deuxième plat," she interrupted gently, switching back to French, "est une bouillabaisse provençale, un hommage à la Méditerranée, aux arômes de safran, d'ail et de soleil." The investor with the accent couldn't help himself. My God, she's describing it like a native. Amelia continued without hesitation. Each dish described with perfect pronunciation, correct grammar, and the kind of cultural depth only someone who had lived the language could possess. By the time she finished her fifth dish, a soft murmur spread through the crowd. People began clapping quietly. The pianist, smiling, struck a gentle note as if to salute her. Arthur's face was pale now. He gripped his glass, unable to meet her eyes. His guests were whispering, and not to him. The power in the room had shifted completely. Amelia looked at him and smiled faintly. "Was that good enough, Mr. Blake, or shall I continue with the dessert section? En français, of course." The crowd laughed, not cruelly, but joyfully. For the first time, the humiliation was his. Arthur forced a smile, his voice tight. "You think you're clever, don't you?" "No," she replied softly. "I just don't like being underestimated." And in that moment, every person in the room realized the game had changed. The woman he tried to humiliate was about to teach him what true power really sounded like. The applause still echoed faintly in Amelia's ears, but inside her thoughts were far away, back in the long, sleepless nights that had brought her to this moment. No one in that shining restaurant could imagine what it had taken for her to stand there with such poise. Her confidence hadn't come from privilege or luck. It had been built, one tear, one sacrifice, one sleepless night at a time. 3 years earlier, while caring for her mother, Amelia discovered that silence could be a cruel companion. The hospital room smelled of disinfectant and despair. Her mother lay still, her once vibrant voice reduced to faint murmurs. To stay sane, Amelia turned again to the one thing that had always given her peace: languages. Late at night, after her mother fell asleep, she'd sit by the window of their small apartment with a cup of cold coffee and an old laptop. The city outside was quiet, but her mind traveled to Paris, to Rome, to the sound of words rolling gently like waves. She started translating old texts, reading medical papers in French, and even tutoring students online just to pay for medication. Every word she spoke kept her from falling apart. Every accent she mastered reminded her that she still was someone, even if the world had forgotten. She'd practice her pronunciation with online videos, whispering softly while her mother slept. "Je suis forte. Je vais réussir. I am strong. I will succeed." There were nights when exhaustion blurred the letters on her screen, nights when her eyes burned, when the noise of machines haunted her even at home. But she never stopped. Because deep down, she knew something the arrogant never understand, that true strength doesn't shout. It endures. Her friends from academia had long stopped calling. Her name was no longer on conference lists or university programs, but she refused to let her knowledge die quietly. She taught herself new dialects, watched documentaries, joined free forums, and even corresponded with a retired linguistics professor in Lyon, who had once told her, "You speak French like you were born with it in your soul." And now, standing under the chandeliers of La Belle Maison, she realized that every lonely night had been preparing her for this one. The arrogance of a rich man had only lit the match, but the fire had been burning in her for years, steady, silent, waiting. As she glanced at Arthur Blake, trembling behind his forced smirk, Amelia felt no hatred, only clarity. Life had tried to silence her, but she had turned that silence into a language of her own, one that spoke louder than money, louder than arrogance, louder than fear. She adjusted the tray in her hands, her heart calm, her eyes sharp. The night wasn't over yet. The lesson had just begun. Arthur Blake tried to laugh, but the sound came out shaky, like glass under pressure. He raised his hand to speak, but before a single word left his mouth, Amelia did something no one expected. She placed the tray down, straightened her shoulders, and looked him in the eyes. "Mr. Blake, before you decide whether I've earned your money, there's something you should know." Her tone was polite, almost gentle, but the entire restaurant fell silent again. Even the waiter at the far corner stopped mid-step, frozen with a bottle of champagne in his hand. Arthur forced a smirk. "And what's that? That you took a night class on YouTube?"
Everyone could feel how close he was to losing control. Amelia didn't flinch. "No," she said softly. "That I taught them." A few heads turned. Arthur frowned. "What are you talking about?" Amelia took a slow breath. "My name isn't just Amelia Torres. It's Dr. Amelia Torres. I have a PhD in linguistics from Cambridge University. I was a lecturer, a researcher, and a consultant for international language programs. I've worked with embassies, universities, and global conferences. I've spent years studying and teaching the languages you just mocked." A collective gasp swept through the room. Arthur's smirk vanished completely. "You expect me to believe that?" Amelia smiled gently. "You don't have to, but you can ask anyone who's read Bridging Words, The Art of Cultural Translation. That was my book." The older investor, Mr. Han, blinked in disbelief. "Wait, that's you? I've read that paper. You're a published linguist." Whispers erupted around the room. A few people even pulled out their phones, confirming her words. The tension shifted like an invisible tide, away from Arthur, toward her. Arthur's face turned red. You're lying. You're a waitress." Amelia's eyes softened. "I'm both. Life doesn't always let you choose which title to use." Her words cut sharper than any insult. Arthur's guests were now staring at him, disgusted. The investors whispered in their native tongues, shaking their heads. One of them, a French businessman, muttered, "Ani Dio. She speaks better French than most Parisians." Amelia continued, her voice unwavering. 3 years ago, I lost everything taking care of my sick mother. I took this job to survive, not because I stopped being who I am. But tonight, you tried to turn my dignity into a joke. And that's something no money can buy back." The silence that followed was deafening. Arthur stood motionless, gripping the edge of the table, his face drained of color. Around him, guests exchanged looks, judgment, shame, pity. Finally, Mr. Han rose from his seat. "Mr. Blake, I think we've seen enough," he said firmly. "You wanted a lesson in power. You just got one." Applause broke out, soft at first, then growing louder until the whole restaurant filled with it. The pianist smiled and began to play again, a slow, graceful melody that felt like victory itself. Amelia didn't bow. She didn't smile triumphantly. She simply looked at Arthur and said, "Some people build their worth through wealth, others through work. Tonight, you learned which one lasts longer." And in that single moment, every ounce of control Arthur Blake thought he had vanished. Arthur Blake stood frozen, as if someone had ripped the floor out from beneath him. His jaw clenched, his hands trembled slightly, but his eyes refused to meet hers. For years, he had been the man who silenced others. Tonight, he was the one without words. The investors exchanged quick, sharp glances, the kind that said more than any argument could. Mr. Han was the first to speak. "Arthur," he said coldly, "I don't think I want to do business with someone who humiliates people for sport." Arthur's head snapped up. "Wait, Han, it was just a joke." "A joke?" Han interrupted. "You offered money to mock a woman, a scholar. You insulted intelligence itself." Beside him, the French businessman shook his head. "You told us she was stuff. You never mentioned you were testing her like an animal." "And now," added another investor, "you've tested your own reputation instead." Arthur tried to speak, but his throat closed. His carefully rehearsed charm, the weapon that had built his empire, had failed him. The laughter that once followed him now cut like knives. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice cracking, "let's not overreact. You all saw—" "What we saw," interrupted Mr. Han, "is that money blinded you to basic decency." As he spoke, people in the restaurant began whispering. Phones came out. Cameras glimmered. Someone had recorded the entire thing.
The challenge, the humiliation, the revelation. Arthur's face flashed across countless screens within minutes. Amelia stood still, composed, the tray still resting near her hand. She didn't need to say another word. The silence spoke for her. Arthur's assistant, pale and trembling, leaned in. "Sir, it's already online." "What?" "Someone posted the video. It's everywhere." Arthur's face drained of color. He turned, scanning the tables. People avoided his gaze. Some whispered. Others simply stared, disappointed, not in a scandal, but in a man who mistook cruelty for confidence. The investors began standing one by one, gathering their coats. Mr. Han extended a hand toward Amelia. "Dr. Torres, it'd be an honor to work with someone of your integrity." Arthur looked between them, panic rising in his chest. "Wait, please, this isn't fair." But fairness had finally arrived, dressed not in wealth or power, but in quiet dignity. By the time the investors left,
was alone at the table, surrounded by untouched dishes and empty glances. His empire hadn't fallen yet, but its foundation had cracked beyond repair. Amelia turned to leave, but paused for a moment. She looked at him, not with anger, but with quiet compassion. "Arrogance is like a language too," she said softly. "The more you speak it, the fewer people understand you." And without another word, she walked away, leaving Arthur Blake to face the echo of his own downfall. 6 months later, the city skyline shimmered under the morning sun. Inside a sleek glass tower on Fifth Avenue, the logo of Han Global Communications gleamed above a polished mahogany desk. Seated behind it was Dr. Amelia Torres, Director of Cultural Relations, a title she had earned not through privilege, but through perseverance. Her days no longer began with trays and aprons. They began with board meetings, conferences, and warm greetings from people who valued her for her mind, not her uniform. Yet, despite her new office, she hadn't changed much. Her desk was simple. A framed photo of her mother smiled beside her computer, and a small note rested under the glass. Dignity is the only language that never loses its meaning. Across town, Arthur Blake's story had taken a very different turn. The viral video of his humiliation had swept across social media like wildfire. "Arrogant tycoon destroyed by waitress doctor," read one headline. Within weeks, sponsors withdrew, investors canceled partnerships, and banks froze his accounts. His company collapsed under the weight of scandal and lawsuits. His wife filed for divorce, taking half of everything. Even his children refused to speak to him. Now, he worked at a mid-tier car dealership on the outskirts of Queens. The same man who once owned skyscrapers, now struggling to sell sedans. Each day he smiled mechanically, hoping customers wouldn't recognize his face. But sometimes they did. One afternoon, while sitting in his small office, he saw a TV screen showing a news segment. Dr. Amelia Torres, one of the most influential voices in intercultural communication, will deliver a keynote lecture at Columbia University tonight. Her image appeared, graceful, confident, radiant. Arthur stared at it for a long time. His reflection in the glass looked older, smaller, emptier. For the first time, he understood what she had meant that night. At that same hour, Amelia stood before a packed auditorium. Her voice was calm, yet every word carried the strength of someone who had walked through fire and come out shining. "Humiliation," she said, "is only powerful when we give it permission. But knowledge, integrity, and kindness, those are unbreakable languages. They outlive arrogance. They outlive money. They outlive everything. The crowd rose in applause. Some people wiped their eyes. As Amelia left the stage, her phone buzzed. A message from the hospital. Her mother had smiled today for the first time in weeks. Amelia looked out the window toward the evening skyline and whispered softly, "We made it, Mama." And in that moment, she knew victory wasn't about revenge. It was about becoming so much more than the pain that tried to define you. Because the greatest fluency of all is knowing how to speak with grace when the world speaks with hate.